They were the rulers of the faith, keepers of tradition, guardians of the sacred. But when God Himself walked among them, they didn't fall at His feet. They plotted His death. The Pharisees believed in the law, studied the scriptures, and controlled the synagogues. The Sadducees ruled the temple, aligned with Rome, and silenced dissent with influence. But when Jesus of Nazareth stepped into their world, He exposed the one thing they couldn't control: truth. And they hated Him for it. Every question they asked was a trap. Every law they twisted was a weapon. But every time, He answered with power. They accused, He forgave. They condemned, He healed. They judged, He loved. And so, they chose a cross over a crown, a murderer over the Messiah. Decades later, the temple fell, stone by stone, fire by fire, the system collapsed. The Sadducees vanished from history. The Pharisees survived, but changed forever. What began as a movement of God became a monument to man, but the Messiah they rejected is still reigning. They memorized the word, but missed the word made flesh. They defended the altar, but killed the lamb. They were sincere, respected, devoted, and they still got it completely wrong. This isn't just their story, it's a warning, a mirror, a question. Are we clinging to systems Jesus came to replace? Are we shutting the door of the kingdom while believing we hold the keys? This is not just a documentary, it's a revelation. Watch the full story now. Pharisees and Sadducees, power, politics, and the fall of a religious empire. Before the Pharisees and Sadducees ever took their first steps into history, the land of Israel had already seen centuries of transformation, trauma, and spiritual rebirth. To truly grasp their origins, we have to travel back to a time of exile, return, and reconstruction. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem fell. The Babylonian Empire crushed Judah, burned the temple to the ground, and dragged its people into exile. The center of Jewish life, both spiritual and national, was torn away in a moment. Priests, prophets, commoners, all uprooted. For nearly 50 years, the exiled Jews wept by the rivers of Babylon, mourning what was lost. But in this tragic moment, something remarkable began to happen. The foundations of a new Judaism were being laid, not on the Temple Mount, but in foreign lands. With no altar, no priesthood, no sacrifice, how could they remain faithful? They turned inward. Synagogues began to form, not as we know them today, but as spaces where the Torah could be read and remembered. Scripture study took on new importance. Prayer became portable. Identity became internal. Then came Cyrus the Great of Persia. In 539 BCE, he conquered Babylon and issued a decree that allowed exiled peoples to return home. For the Jews, this was nothing short of a miracle. Many returned to Jerusalem with hope in their hearts, and Ezra and Nehemiah as their guides. They rebuilt the temple, modest compared to Solomon's, but still sacred. Ezra, a scribe and priest, played a pivotal role in this new era. He didn't just oversee rituals, he called the people back to the law. Public readings of Torah became moments of national reflection. The law was no longer just a priestly code, it was the heartbeat of the people. The written Torah, its interpretation, and how it was applied in everyday life started becoming central. But this new beginning wasn't without division. The returnees from exile found their homeland occupied by those who had never left. Tensions grew. Who had the authority to define Judaism now? Was it the returning elites or the commoners who had stayed and adapted? And soon, another cultural earthquake shook the land: Greece. By the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great had swept across the known world, bringing with him not just armies, but ideas. Hellenism, Greek language, philosophy, gymnasiums, drama, and gods began to permeate Jewish cities. Some Jews embraced it, others resisted, and some tried to blend the two. This period saw the birth of a cultural divide that would echo for generations. Those who sought to preserve Jewish distinctiveness versus those who were open to reform and integration. Then came the Seleucid Empire, inheriting parts of Alexander's conquests, and with it Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a name burned into Jewish memory. He outlawed Jewish practices, desecrated the temple, and erected an altar to Zeus. It was a dark time, but it sparked something fierce. Out of this oppression rose the Maccabees, a family of priestly rebels who led a revolt and reclaimed the temple in 164 BCE. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a spiritual revival. The rededication of the temple gave birth to Hanukkah, a festival of light and resistance. The Maccabees, or Hasmoneans, became both kings and high priests, a controversial move. Religion and politics became deeply intertwined. They claimed divine authority, but also embraced Hellenistic titles and customs. Their reign brought stability, but also corruption and conflict. And it was in this atmosphere of post-exilic reform, Hellenistic pressure, and Hasmonean rule that the seeds of the Pharisees and Sadducees were sown. The people needed guidance, they needed voices, and two very different groups began to emerge. The early scribes, descendants of Ezra's reforms, began to evolve. They weren't priests, but they held the people's respect. They interpreted the Torah, debated its meaning, and taught it in local gatherings. These were the spiritual ancestors of the Pharisees. Meanwhile, the priestly elites who held sway in the temple, now enmeshed with the Hasmonean dynasty, consolidated power. They were deeply involved in sacrifices and rituals. They aligned themselves with political rulers. These were the forerunners of the Sadducees. By the 2nd century BCE, these groups began to crystallize. The Pharisees championed a Judaism that could survive exile, diaspora, and even the loss of the temple. They believed in oral tradition, passed down through generations as equally binding as written law. They emphasized purity, not just for priests, but for all Jews. Their influence came from the streets, the synagogues, and the study halls. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were anchored to the temple. They rejected the oral law. They held that only the written Torah was authoritative. They did not believe in resurrection, angels, or an afterlife. Their world was here and now. Their power came from their position in the priesthood, their wealth, and their proximity to political rule. This wasn't just a theological rift. It was social, economic, and ideological. The Pharisees were closer to the people. The Sadducees were closer to power. The Pharisees envisioned a Judaism that could live anywhere in any generation. The Sadducees were guardians of a system that worked only as long as the temple stood. But the story didn't evolve in isolation. During this same period, the Jewish people were also wrestling with how to interpret their scriptures in the absence of clear prophetic voices. The prophetic era was drawing to a close, and in its place rose a new authority, the interpreter of the law. This shift wasn't just a spiritual evolution, it was a social revolution. In earlier times, the priesthood was the uncontested religious authority. But now, people began turning to those who could explain, debate, and apply the Torah to real life. They weren't offering sacrifices, they were offering wisdom. These scribes and teachers were gaining not just respect, but influence. This was the soil from which the Pharisees would eventually grow. Meanwhile, political power was constantly shifting. After the Hasmonean revolt, the dynasty they created did not simply return the people to a pure form of Judaism. Instead, the Hasmoneans became increasingly autocratic and eventually divided. They mixed religious authority with kingly power, and not all Jews agreed with this direction. This discontent became a fertile breeding ground for rival factions. In particular, it is believed that the Pharisees rose in opposition to certain Hasmonean policies, especially when the rulers tried to impose Sadducean interpretations of the law. The Pharisees became the voice of dissent, demanding a return to the purity of tradition, but also adapting it for a new era. They were deeply rooted in Scripture, but also in the lives of ordinary people. Their power didn't come from the temple, it came from the community. And the Sadducees, their influence continued to flow through Jerusalem's highest courts. They were the aristocrats, often from priestly families, embedded in the machinery of the state. Many were aligned with the ruling class. They valued stability, tradition, and order, but their focus was on the here and now. For them, God's justice was found in prosperity, lineage, and control over the temple. These contrasting views, heavenly versus earthly focus, oral versus written tradition, inclusion versus exclusivity, began to solidify. The Pharisees sought to democratize holiness. The Sadducees sought to protect the sanctity of the temple system. Another turning point came with the growth of the synagogue. While the temple remained the center of national worship, the synagogue emerged as the heart of local community life. Here, Torah was read aloud, discussed, and interpreted. It was in these modest spaces, not the grand temple, that the seeds of rabbinic Judaism were first planted. As Greek culture continued to exert pressure, the tension between preservation and adaptation grew even sharper. Some Jews fully embraced Greek life, adopting Greek names, attending Greek theaters, and even undergoing painful surgeries to reverse circumcision. Others clung tighter to their identity, finding in the Torah not just divine law, but a shield against assimilation. The Pharisees were often at the front lines of this cultural resistance. Their teaching spread not through wealth or priestly privilege, but through personal influence and public instruction. They were the ones discussing law in the marketplaces, offering guidance in small villages, and answering questions in the synagogues. The Sadducees, by contrast, became more entrenched in the elite centers of power. As the Hasmonean dynasty declined and Roman influence began to rise, their political involvement only deepened. But their dependence on the temple would eventually become their greatest vulnerability. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the lines had been drawn. The Pharisees were the teachers of the people. The Sadducees were the guardians of the temple. Both claimed to be the true heirs of Moses. Both believed they were preserving the faith, but they were walking two very different paths. And those paths were about to cross in dramatic ways. The Pharisees didn't rise to power in a single moment or through a single man. Their emergence was slow, organic, rooted in the aftermath of exile, and nourished by a longing to bring sacred law into everyday life. They didn't seek thrones or temples, they sought understanding. And that quiet pursuit would eventually place them at the very heart of Jewish identity. Their name, Pharisee, comes from the Hebrew word perushim, meaning separated ones. But what were they separating from? It wasn't the world itself. It was impurity, compromise, corruption. To the Pharisees, holiness didn't belong only to priests or high places. It belonged in the streets, the homes, the dinner tables of ordinary Jews. It could be practiced by anyone who loved God's law. They were born from the legacy of the scribes, those who, during and after the exile, devoted themselves to copying, studying, and interpreting the Torah. While the priesthood managed the temple, the scribes managed memory, preserving the covenant through written word and oral tradition. Over time, some of these scribes grew into teachers of the law. They were called chachamim, the wise, but their wisdom wasn't just bookish, it was lived. They debated how to observe the Sabbath, not in theory, but in practice. What should a woman do if her oven breaks just before sunset? How far can a man walk before it becomes labor? How should justice be done in small villages far from Jerusalem? In these questions, the Pharisees found their mission to bring divine law into daily life. They believed that Moses received two revelations at Sinai, the written law and the oral law. The written law was recorded in scrolls. The oral law was passed down through generations. And this oral tradition, they claimed, was just as sacred. This belief set them apart. The Sadducees, who would later become their ideological rivals, rejected this notion entirely. For them, only the written Torah had authority. But the Pharisees saw the oral law as the living heartbeat of Judaism, dynamic, interpretive, and responsive to real-world situations. Their teachings took root in synagogues across Judea and Galilee. Unlike the centralized worship of the temple, the synagogue was local, personal, and participatory. It was here that Pharisaic influence grew, not by decree, but by dialogue. They didn't rule, They reasoned, they taught, they listened, and in doing so, they gained the respect of the people. The Pharisees emphasized three central practices: Torah, study, prayer, and acts of kindness. These were things anyone could do, regardless of wealth or birth. In a society where religious privilege was often linked to lineage, the Pharisees opened the doors of holiness to everyone. They also believed in the resurrection of the dead, angels, and divine judgment in the afterlife, concepts that were gaining traction in Jewish thought, possibly influenced by Persian ideas. These beliefs gave hope to the oppressed. Justice wasn't just for this life, it was eternal, but their journey wasn't without opposition. During the Hasmonean dynasty, especially under rulers like John Hyrcanus, tensions between Pharisees and Sadducees intensified. Initially, the Hasmoneans had Pharisaic sympathies, but as they sought political legitimacy and priestly authority, they leaned toward the Sadducees, who supported their consolidation of temple power. Hyrcanus, once friendly with the Pharisees, turned against them when they questioned his lineage and fitness to serve as high priest. This began a period of political suppression for the Pharisees. They were barred from certain courts, silenced in some synagogues, and mocked by the elite. Yet they endured. Why? Because their strength wasn't in institutions, it was in the people. They had planted their teachings in the hearts of the masses, and no king or priest could uproot that. The Pharisees became known for their humility, their scholarship, and their debates. They developed intricate legal discussions known as machloket, respectful arguments that explored every angle of a question. They believed that through honest disagreement, deeper truths could emerge. They preserved not just law, but the method of thinking about law. Their leaders weren't born into greatness. They earned it. Men like Yosef ben Yoezer, Yehoshua ben Parachia, and later Hillel and Shammai became guiding lights. Some were poor, some were immigrants, but all were respected for their wisdom and character. Hillel, in particular, would become a towering figure. He taught, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, the rest is commentary. Go and learn it." This spirit of compassion and clarity became a hallmark of Pharisaic thought. But they were not perfect. The Pharisees could be strict. Their love of the law sometimes veered into legalism. They were human, prone to pride, internal disputes, and occasional hypocrisy, something that later critiques, including those by Jesus, would highlight. But at their best, they were a bridge between heaven and earth, a voice that reminded the people, you don't have to be a priest to be holy. By the time Rome began asserting control over Judea, the Pharisees had become a major force. Not political, but spiritual, not royal, but respected. They were shaping the future of Judaism from within. Another defining characteristic of the Pharisees was their approach to community leadership. They saw themselves not as distant authorities, but as guides walking alongside the people. When there was confusion about the law, they didn't simply issue commands. They reasoned, discussed, illustrated. Their stories, or midrashim, brought the scriptures to life. They made the ancient words breathe in new situations. They also placed great importance on ethical behavior. For the Pharisees, it wasn't enough to follow rituals. One's heart had to align with one's actions. Honesty in business, compassion for the poor, respect for others, these were not just civic duties, but spiritual obligations. This made them approachable and trustworthy in the eyes of many ordinary Jews. Unlike the Sadducees, who often isolated themselves among the upper echelons of society, the Pharisees were embedded in local life. They were found in markets, in study groups, even traveling from village to teach. Their accessibility gave them moral authority, and this connection to the grassroots made them more resilient against political storms. One of the fascinating aspects of Pharisaic thought was their openness to debate, even internal disagreement. Within the Pharisaic ranks there were major schools of thought, most famously the schools of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel's teachings emphasized mercy and patience. Shammai was known for his strictness and precision. Their followers often clashed on points of law, yet both were considered valid and respected. This internal pluralism made the Pharisees dynamic and intellectually alive. They weren't just defending a static set of beliefs, they were evolving, adapting, questioning. They believed that the divine will could be sought through honest inquiry, and they weren't afraid of complexity. This flexibility would become one of their greatest strengths, especially when the unimaginable happened, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. But even before that fateful moment, their adaptability was setting them apart. As Roman influence deepened in Judea, tension between different Jewish factions grew. The Sadducees often aligned themselves with the Herodian rulers and Roman officials to maintain their temple authority. The Pharisees, meanwhile, grew increasingly wary of foreign control and internal corruption. They called for a renewal of the heart, not just the ritual. They taught that love of neighbor and love of God were inseparable. They reminded people that the true sanctuary of God was not just in stone and gold, but in the way a person lived. This message resonated deeply, especially among the oppressed and marginalized. While the Sadducees preserved the grandeur of a system centered on sacrifice, the Pharisees offered a vision of faith that could be practiced anywhere, even in exile. And so their influence spread. Not everyone admired them. Critics accused them of legalism, of adding burdens through endless rules. But others saw in them the protectors of a faith that could endure beyond war, exile, and empire. Their story is not just one of religious leadership. It's a story of resilience, of wisdom passed from parent to child, teacher to student, generation to generation. A story of how law became love and tradition became life. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about the Pharisees. Their vision wasn't limited to the moment they lived in. They were building something that could outlast kingdoms, something flexible enough to survive loss, and yet firm enough to hold a people together. They saw faith not as a relic of the past, but as a path forward. Through their efforts, the spirit of Judaism became something portable, teachable, and deeply personal. They didn't just preserve the law, they made it live. If the Pharisees were born from the grassroots, rising from the hearts and homes of everyday people, the Sadducees were born in marble halls and temple courts. They were the aristocrats, the priests, the old guard of religious authority. Where the Pharisees embraced adaptability, the Sadducees clung to tradition, at least the parts that secured their place in the hierarchy. Their name likely comes from Zadok, the high priest during the time of King David and Solomon. The Sadducees claimed descent from him, and thus a divine right to priestly leadership. They saw themselves as the rightful stewards of the temple, the sacrificial system, and the religious calendar of Israel. Their authority wasn't debated, it was inherited. Their domain was the temple, and everything that surrounded it: sacrifices, festivals, purity rituals, and tithes. And in the temple, they held court, not just religiously but economically. Control of the temple meant control of immense resources. Pilgrims came from all over the Jewish world to offer sacrifices. Livestock, grain, money, all flowed through temple gates. And the Sadducees oversaw it all. They were the elite, wealthy, educated, and connected. Many Sadducees were members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court. They lived in luxury compared to the average Judean. Their homes in Jerusalem were adorned with mosaics and stone carvings. Their influence was felt not just in religion, but in politics. This is where the Sadducees set themselves apart, not just from the Pharisees, but from much of the Jewish population. They actively aligned themselves with foreign rulers, first the Hasmoneans and later the Romans. To the Sadducees, compromise with power wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Maintaining the temple required stability, and stability came from diplomacy, but this alliance came at a cost. While they held power at the top, they began losing respect at the bottom. The common people, increasingly influenced by Pharisaic teaching, saw the Sadducees as out of touch. Their rejection of the oral law alienated them from the broader spiritual discourse happening in synagogues and study circles. Doctrinally, the Sadducees were radically different from the Pharisees. They accepted only the written Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, as authoritative. Prophets and writings were not on equal footing, nor did they believe in the resurrection of the dead, in angels, or in any kind of afterlife. For them, the rewards and punishments of life were experienced here and now. This materialist worldview may seem cold today, but it made sense in their context. If God had made a covenant with Israel, and if they were the custodians of his temple, then blessings should be evident in this life, in land, power, and peace. The afterlife was a foreign, unnecessary distraction. Their literalist approach to Scripture also meant they resisted innovations in the law. Where the Pharisees saw room for interpretation and adaptation, the Sadducees saw only what was written. No expansions, no oral traditions, just the text. Despite these rigidities, the Sadducees were highly intelligent, their legal minds were sharp, their command of temple law unparalleled. They presided over disputes, issued judgments, and maintained order. In many ways, they were the institutional memory of ancient Israel's priestly heritage. But they were also vulnerable. Their entire identity was wrapped around the temple. Without it, they had nothing. No synagogues to fall back on, no grassroots movement. Their theology, practice, and power were geographically and spiritually rooted in a single location, a single structure. This dependence made them fierce defenders of the status quo. Any movement that threatened the temple's authority or their own was met with suspicion or suppression. This included the Pharisees, and it certainly included a carpenter's son from Galilee named Jesus. The ideological rift between the Pharisees and Sadducees was not confined to academic disputes. It shaped public perception and national identity. People in the marketplaces debated halakhic interpretations just as passionately as they debated Roman taxes. These weren't remote religious ideas. They were questions that affected their daily food, mourning customs, and social status. Imagine a young boy growing up in Judea, listening to his father describe why they washed their hands before eating, or why they refused to mix linen and wool. These practices were not just rules, they were part of a living relationship with God. For Pharisees, each law held layers of meaning, cultivated over generations of dialogue and tradition. For the Sadducees, simplicity and textual clarity were paramount. If it wasn't in the Torah, it had no place in the faith. Meanwhile, among the people, new messianic movements began to rise. Prophets, preachers, and would-be deliverers filled the streets. The air was thick with hope, fear, and revolutionary fervor. Many Pharisees remained cautious, concerned about the theological implications of false messiahs. The Sadducees feared any disruption that might endanger the temple's fragile peace. And into this moment stepped Jesus of Nazareth. He didn't challenge just theology, he challenged power. He critiqued the Pharisees for hypocrisy, but he also turned over tables in the temple, directly confronting the Sadducean-controlled system. He questioned the necessity of sacrifices. He preached forgiveness without the altar. He taught in fields and streets, mirroring the Pharisees' style, but pushing their boundaries. The Sadducees viewed him as a dangerous threat. He was charismatic, popular, and unpredictable. He didn't respect temple protocols. He talked of destruction and rebuilding. For a group whose very identity was tied to the permanence of the temple, this was heresy. But even some Pharisees were conflicted. Jesus echoed their values: love, mercy, justice. Yet he rebuked their rigidity, exposed their blind spots, and challenged their spiritual pride. He reminded them that laws must serve life, not suffocate it. Even within their own circles, both the Pharisees and Sadducees were experiencing internal pressure. Younger members of the Pharisaic schools began pushing for reforms that emphasized love over law, while more conservative elders insisted on maintaining strict boundaries. Among the Sadducees, debates simmered over how much Roman control was too much and whether the temple's dignity was being traded for comfort. This internal unrest mirrored the broader societal cracks. The common people, overburdened by taxes, regulations, and spiritual fatigue, were losing patience with leaders who seemed more concerned with prestige than justice. And while both groups had once seen themselves as shepherds of Israel, they were increasingly seen as gatekeepers blocking the way to God. It was in this tension that Jesus' popularity soared. His parables spoke to the brokenhearted. His actions, healing on the Sabbath, eating with sinners, redefined what holiness looked like. He neither confirmed nor denied either camp's authority. Instead, he introduced something radically new: the idea that the kingdom of God was not found in courts or ceremonies, but in compassion, humility, and faith. His teaching struck at the core of both sects' foundations. For the Sadducees, it was an existential threat. If the temple was no longer the gate to salvation, what was left? For the Pharisees, it was a mirror held up to their own faults, a call to remember the heart behind the commandments. The power games escalated quickly. Political leaders, religious factions, and Roman enforcers all became entangled in a web of plots, betrayals, and fearful calculations. In the background of it all, the people watched, hungry for truth, tired of control. The temple stood tall, but the soul of the nation was being torn. And in that space, a carpenter's son walked between worlds, disrupting every assumption. Jesus of Nazareth stepped into a world divided. The Pharisees and Sadducees had already carved their identities into Jewish life, one through tradition and teaching, the other through temple and control. But Jesus was different. He wasn't a rabbi trained in Pharisaic schools, nor was he a priest from the Sadducean elite. He was an outsider, a carpenter from Galilee with no formal status, yet he spoke with a kind of authority that neither group could ignore. His encounters with both the Pharisees and Sadducees were defining moments, not just for his own ministry, but for the evolution of Jewish and Christian thought. These weren't simple debates. They were spiritual confrontations. Jesus didn't enter the fray to join a side. He came to challenge the very foundation of how power, piety, and righteousness were being defined. Let's begin with the Pharisees. Jesus shared more theological ground with the Pharisees than with the Sadducees. He believed in the resurrection, in angels, in divine judgment. He taught in parables, interpreted the Torah, and spent time in synagogues. And yet, his most pointed critiques were often aimed at the Pharisees. Why? Because they were the closest to what he believed, and because they held a deep influence over the people. When he saw Pharisees placing legal burdens on the poor while neglecting mercy, he called them out. When he saw them seeking public praise instead of inner transformation, he used sharp, poetic language to reveal their hypocrisy. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites," he said. "You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence." But these weren't just insults, they were prophetic warnings. Jesus saw the danger of empty ritual, of law without love. His goal wasn't to destroy the Pharisaic tradition, but to purify it. He wanted to restore the soul behind the rules, the heart behind the holiness. Not all Pharisees rejected him. Nicodemus came to him by night, seeking truth. Others invited him to meals, listened to his teachings, even warned him of plots against his life. His relationship with the Pharisees was complex, marked by conflict, but also conversation. The Sadducees were different. Jesus had fewer interactions with them, but those moments were explosive. They often tried to trap him with clever legal puzzles. In one instance, they asked him about the resurrection, presenting a hypothetical scenario about a woman who had been married to 7 brothers. "At the resurrection," they asked mockingly, "whose wife will she be?" Jesus responded not with scorn, but with revelation. "You are in error," he said, "because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. In the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven." It was a stunning rebuke. He challenged their disbelief in the afterlife and exposed the limits of their literalism. To them, the resurrection was a fantasy. To Jesus, it was the cornerstone of hope. But perhaps his most radical encounter with the Sadducean system was not verbal, it was physical. He entered the temple courts and turned over tables. He drove out money changers. "My house will be called a house of prayer," he declared, "but you are making it a den of robbers." This wasn't just a protest against corruption, it was a direct challenge to the Sadducees' authority. The temple economy was their domain. The sacrificial system was their pride. And here was Jesus threatening it all. In that moment, he wasn't a philosopher. He was a prophet with fire in his eyes, and the Sadducees knew it. From that point on, their resolve to eliminate him hardened. These confrontations revealed a deep truth. Jesus wasn't trying to fit into the existing categories. He was creating a new one that saw purity not in hand-washing but in peacemaking, one that saw holiness not in temple rituals but in caring for the least. And this vision frightened both sects. The Pharisees feared the loss of structure, the Sadducees feared the loss of power, and Rome feared the loss of control. The deeper Jesus delved into public teaching, the more confrontational his presence became for both religious groups. He was not simply offering theological nuance, he was subverting entire systems of status, ritual, and exclusivity. To the Pharisees, Jesus was a paradox. He taught Torah, but walked through grain fields on the Sabbath. He honored the prophets, but dined with sinners. He called for righteousness, yet broke with customs. And always he spoke with authority, not quoting famous rabbis, but declaring truth from within himself. "You have heard it said, but I say to you." His words challenged the interpretive traditions the Pharisees cherished. They feared that his teachings, if followed, would undermine the structures they had fought to protect. Yet even some among them were moved. Pharisees debated among themselves, was he a prophet or a blasphemer, a reformer or a rebel? The diversity within their ranks meant that not all opposed him. Some were drawn to his wisdom. Others feared the crowd's growing devotion more than the man himself. The Sadducees, however, felt little ambiguity. To them, Jesus was dangerous, not just because of his resurrection teaching, but because of what it meant for their hold on the temple. If people no longer needed priests and sacrifices to access God, what then? Jesus' movement threatened the very pillars of their power: ritual, hierarchy, and the exclusivity of the sacred space. Behind closed doors, both Pharisees and Sadducees debated what to do. The Sadducees had more political leverage. The Pharisees had more spiritual sway. Together, they found common cause in preserving the fragile status quo. They reached out to Herodians and Roman officials. They whispered about blasphemy and unrest. And eventually, they seized him. But even in death, Jesus challenged their narratives. History is a mirror that shows us who we are by reflecting who we've been. And in the story of the Pharisees and Sadducees, we find the seeds of two enduring legacies: Judaism and Christianity, each shaped by ancient conflict, spiritual longing, and the echo of a man who walked between both. If this opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your voice belongs in this story. Let's keep history alive together.